Okay, Neal, it's preparing to stream.
All right.
Good morning. We are here with for our immigrant visa Q&A with our visas expert, Neal. My name's Alyssa Zielinski. I work for the Bureau of Consular Affairs, Office of Public Affairs. And Neal, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Alyssa. My name is Neal Vermillion. I am a division chief here in the Visa Office, Bureau of Consular Affairs. Specifically, my division is the Office of Field Operations, where, among other duties, we provide guidance to our consular sections in our embassies and consulates around the world. And just as a little bit of more background, I've served in the Department of State since the early 2000s, so under 4 different presidential administrations. I've worked overseas in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia. And I know our topic of the day that we're going to be focusing on is the immigrant visa backlog situation. So, despite my experience, or in light of my experience, I can at least say that this situation is definitely unprecedented. So I'm glad we have this opportunity to talk and answer what questions might be out there. Thank you, Alyssa.
All right. I just want to remind our audience before we get started, this event is live streaming and it will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. It's intended to address the issues of general interest related to our current immigrant visa process and immigrant visa backlog. And unfortunately, we cannot take questions related to non-immigrant visas or case-specific questions. We cannot take case-specific questions. Please comment your question in the comment section of the YouTube Live. And if we can't get to your question live, we will continue to answer questions in the comments after our broadcast ends. So, Neal, we're going to start with some of our common questions that we receive about immigrant visas. First off, what are we doing to decrease the IVE backlogs worldwide?
Thanks for that, Alyssa. Let me actually, if I can, spend a few minutes. Let me put that question on hold just for a few minutes, and I want to get back just to make sure everyone who's listening is on the same page when we talk about the backlog. So I'd like to give you a little bit of history here, so we have a common understanding and a common framework of what we're looking at, and say a few remarks before we get to that question and the other specific one. So just bear with me for a minute. But in terms of the history, here we are, almost June 2021. As those of you that might follow our immigrant visa processing overseas know, we actually shut down due to the pandemic. Visa processing shut down for several months last year at this time, and we really didn't start the reopening process until July of last year. So one significant factor, I guess, if you will, that's leading to this backlog discussion we're having today. Another point I want to highlight, that's another prong of why we are at where we're at, is you may recall last spring as well, then President Trump signed Presidential Proclamation 10014, which President Biden rescinded in late February of this year. But that prevented the issuance, even when we were open and our consular sections were processing some visas, that prevented the issuance and travel of many immigrant visas, all different types of immigrant visas. So that's a separate prong. And a third prong, as long as we're talking about presidential proclamations, is some of you may be aware or seen on our websites, there are actually still in effect geographic proclamations, as we call them, which basically are, again, presidential proclamations that have been issued to help protect the homeland, protect health, protect security. Currently, there are proclamations in effect that cover 33 countries, which basically say anyone that has been present in any of these 33 countries for the last 14 days can't travel to the United States, and that means we can't issue visas to them. The good news now, just in the last month, however, is that none of these proclamations currently stand in the way. On April 7th, Secretary of State Blinken signed a national interest determination that accepted immigrant visa applicants and fiancés from those proclamations. So that's a little bit of good news to start. But that history that I just went through of the presidential proclamations protecting the labor market, the geographic proclamations, the shutting down because of the pandemic itself, not to even mention the individual circumstances at each and every embassy and consulate, all that led to a significant backlog. And as I said earlier, an unprecedented backlog. And this is an important point I'll get to as we answer some of these questions, the pandemic still exists. So getting out of this backlog is not a linear process at all. Personally, I was overseas till last year, and I'm actually grateful to be back in the United States, where I think I just saw a news article saying vaccination rates are, for adults at least, are about 50% and on the way up. So that is great news, and the pandemic does appear to be easing, especially in the United States. But overseas, other countries, the situation's not so simple. I won't want to go into detail of every single country. I just can't on this call. But last week, as an example, I talked with managers of a large immigrant visa processing post, and they just reviewed their last few months with me and their operating status. And they mentioned 2 of the local staff had actually passed away due to COVID. Less than 1% of the country's population had been vaccinated. So the consular section there has gone through a series of closures and reopenings, implementing social distance where practical. Obviously, other posts are in much better shape than that, but this post is not an exception, facing staff that are ill or even dying in this case. A pandemic that is more rampant in the host country than it is actually here. So I just want to start with that background to really talk about why the backlog is developed. Let me, again, before getting to the actual question, I apologize before I get to the actual question you posed. In terms of the Ivy backlog, it exists, it's there. And, we really do understand the frustrations. I'm sure there's probably frustrated people listening into this call, asking about their particular case or the loved one of this particular case. We truly do understand the frustrations and the hardships, both by the people that are petitioning for their loved ones, by the applicants who are waiting longer than anyone of us would really like for a visa interview. And I want everyone out there around the world listening, whether it's evening, afternoon, morning, to please know we're working as hard as our resources and conditions allow to adjudicate visa applications as quickly as possible. Obviously, it's our job to do that. It's what we're paid for. It's the right thing to do. Also, President Biden signed an executive order basically directing us to do that. It's the executive order you may know is 14012, entitled Restoring Faith in Our Legal Immigration System. And we intend to do our part to do that.
Thank you so much, Neal, for all of that background. I think that that's really important for everyone to understand all of the different factors that come into this situation that we find ourselves in now. So with all of that in mind, there are things that we are doing, and we are committed to decreasing the IV backlogs worldwide. So what do you have to say for the things that we can do to decrease the backlogs?
Exactly. We're fully committed to reducing that backlog. And honestly, this keeping everyone informed is part of that effort. That's one reason why, we're doing this. I also want to highlight that we have started posting in the last month, and we'll update monthly on our travel.state.gov website, the stats of the immigrant visa backlog. Just to briefly talk about some numbers, if that's helpful. The National Visa Center, the current number of immigrant visa applications that are ready for interviews but not yet scheduled is 481,965. And that's, if you guys think that's a big number, yeah, that is a big number. That's almost 500,000 cases. And that frankly is up from 408,255, which was a figure in January. That's up from, if you want to compare when our last normal month of processing was, that's back in January of 2020. So almost 15, 16, 17 months ago. That was less than 80,000 was the backlog then. So That number is there. As I said, it's increasing. It will fluctuate over time. This is not a linear process. And I know that number doesn't include cases that were already at posts or cases where people may have already submitted their applications to the petitions to the Department of Homeland Security colleagues, but the case hasn't gotten to NVC yet. So, long-winded answer to your question, but I want to start by saying we want to be transparent about this. You can update and look at our website every month to see what information is out there. In terms of what we're doing, we're throwing all available resources that we can in that, and we're specifically telling our consular sections in our embassies and consulates overseas that after consular sections, of course, are responsible for U.S. citizens and providing support to U.S. citizens. But after that, with respect to visa services, the processing of immigrant visa and fiancé visa is our number one priority, particularly for all immigrant immediate relatives and family-sponsored applicants. So that is number one, and first and foremost. Please understand we're continuing to deal with circumstances on the ground that we can talk about as we go through this session. And the volume and type of visa cases, will continue to depend on local circumstances. But we're doing our best to process these applications as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and as safely as possible, while we protect both our applicants as well as our staff from the further spread of the pandemic.
Thanks, Neal, for all of that. That's great information. Moving on to another question we often get: how are IV applicants being prioritized? And you detailed it a little bit, but if you could just elaborate for those interview appointments.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, this is another article I would like to point out. I'll go through the information here, but it's also posted in our newsroom on the travel.state.gov. So encourage people to look there as well. Basically, we have any number of immigrant visa categories, as many of you know. We have immediate relatives, we have employment-based visas, we have family preference visas, we have diversity visas. We truly recognize the importance of each immigrant visa category and don't want to minimize the importance of those categories. However, during the pandemic, we've been forced to make difficult decisions about how our consular sections should prioritize these applications as they operate in local conditions and before we reach full capacity. So to be clear, as we've developed this framework, this prioritization framework, the underlying principle on which we base this is the primacy of family reunification. It's a clear priority of the U.S. government. It's a priority expressed in the law that oversees immigration, which is the Immigration and Nationality Act. And specifically, our prioritization guidance that we've given both publicly as well as to our consular sections relies on clear direction from Congress that the department must adopt the policy of prioritizing immediate family relatives and K-1 fiancé visas, followed by family preferences. So to get down in the nitty gritty, let's talk about this in detail, because this is, as you mentioned, a really popular question a lot of people ask. So we've given our divided immigrant visa work into 4 priority tiers. We have instructed consular sections where possible to schedule some appointments within all 4 priority tiers. So we're not shutting out any one tier. That said, the majority of cases that a section will process, if they're able to, are going to be in the first 2 tiers. So what are the first 2 tiers? Tier 1 are going to be immediate relative adoption visas, what we call age out cases, which are cases where the applicant will soon no longer qualify because of their age, and certain special immigrant visas, specifically for Afghan and Iraqi nationals who work with our forces and our government, over the last several decades during the conflicts there. Mm-hmm. Tier 2 then are going to be other immediate relative visas. The range of immediate relative visas from spouses to parents, fiancé visas, and returning resident visas. And then the final 2 tiers, tier 3, are going to be family preference visas, other special immigrant visas for certain employees of the U.S. government, and finally the fourth tier, all other immigrant visas, which includes then employment preference and diversity visas. So that's the framework we've given. As mentioned, we're going to try to do as much as we can within each of those tiers. We will do consular sections that are going to process at least some cases, each of those tiers, with, again, the priority being on the first two. I hope that answers that question, and happy to take on other questions as well.
Definitely. I think that was very thorough. Thanks, Neal. Next question is that we get often is, will DV 2021 selectees be able to get an interview ahead of that September 30th, 2021 deadline?
Yeah, diversity visas are definitely a hot topic. We've gotten this question before. The good news, let me start with the good news, which is, again, talking about what I mentioned earlier, which is Presidential Proclamation 10014 was rescinded. So for almost the first half of this fiscal year, we were unable to process diversity visas because of that proclamation. And as I'm sure many of the people that are interested in diversity visas know, that visa program is specific to the fiscal year. So I can tell you that our colleagues responsible for this program, which is the Kentucky Consular Center, has begun scheduling documentally qualified visas. I know we've issued many visas already. And I want to reiterate to anyone listening that we in the State Department do value the diversity visa program. So I want to emphasize that point again. We've processed some cases, and we truly value the diversity visa program. We're going to do what we can. That said, this pandemic, as mentioned, is unpredictable. I mentioned that one post I talked about, which COVID spiked there in the last month. I think you've seen spikes in South Asia, other places. It's impossible to really forecast how many DVs we'll issue this year. I do want to set appropriate expectations and say that it's very likely we won't issue the full allotment allowed by the statutory ceiling. Again, those of you that follow the program may be aware there's 55,000 that is the maximum allowed each year. And that's a ceiling. We can't go over that. And how close we actually get to that number each year varies year by year. Obviously, last year, this year with the pandemic, the circumstances have restricted our ability to get as close to that ceiling as we'd like. We're committed to doing as much as possible. As mentioned earlier, we have local conditions and restrictions that will force us to prioritize. But at least I can reiterate the good news that we've started processing, we've started issuing. We're going to do as much as we can by the end of the fiscal year, but it will not be near the 55,000 allowed by the statute.
Yes, understood. Yeah, that is good news, but also, we have to remember there are restrictions that next question is related, another diversity visa question. Will DV 2020 selectees who were not interviewed prior to September 30th, 2020 be interviewed?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. And I understand the frustration by applicants last year. It's kind of the flip side of what this year was. The pandemic started halfway through the fiscal year, so we were processing very smoothly through the first half of the fiscal year, and then just shut down, and we're unable to again get near that statutory ceiling last year. Go back to what I said earlier, which is, again, probably reiterating what people know, but the diversity visa program is a fiscal year program. So applicants who were refused because of that proclamation I mentioned last year can't be really interviewed, scheduled, or reconsidered for visas. The terms of these program and the fact that it's specific to the fiscal year is outlined in statute. So a black and white answer, and it's an unfortunate answer, I know, for those of you that are interested in the program, but that's the answer.
Right. And if you did win, or if you were selected for DV 2020, you can apply, or you can enter future diversity visa lotteries.
That's a great point. Yeah, exactly right. And I know many people have entered the program, applied for the program year after year after year, and then 15, 20 years down the road, they finally get it and are actually able to go through the entire process. So there's no guarantee, of course. It is a selection process, but it is yearly. And if people are truly interested in it, I do encourage people to submit an application the following year.
All right. Next question is, how come IV applicants can't be interviewed virtually, maybe via Zoom or, other virtual platform?
That's another good question. Obviously, we're doing Zoom and YouTube and things like that here. Technology has changed quite a bit. But I'll give you a simple, straightforward answer, which, again, may not be the most welcome answer, but it's immigrant and non-immigrant visa applicants are required by statute and regulation to appear in person before a consular officer. So it comes down to statute and regulation. As a consular officer who's worked in the field, I also just talk about, there are benefits with this process. National security is our top priority when we adjudicate visa applications. Each prospective traveler undergoes extensive screening. And as part of that, we have this interview process where our officers not only look at the visa application, but they talk to the applicant. They look at the body language. They figure out what the applicant is saying to make an informed decision about whether the person's eligible and whether there are any national security related concerns. So that's more of a long-winded answer, but the short answer, as mentioned, is based in statute and regulation.
Definitely. Well, that's the end of our kind of frequently asked questions that we get all the time. We're going to move into some of the questions that we are receiving live in our comments section. And just a reminder, if your question is not answered during this live event, we are going to go back and answer questions in the comments sections of the live event after the broadcast has concluded. So first question is from Moonlight. Can you talk one more time about K-1 visas specifically and where they are in the priority list? I know we mentioned it, but maybe just specifically about K-1 visas.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. K-1 visas are a priority. Let's just to review. I mentioned 4 tiers of immigrant visa priority, and that the majority of consular sections, the interview workload will focus on the first 2 tiers. Immigrant visas are in that, but fiancé visas are in that as well. Specifically, if you look on our website, fiancé visas are listed along with, spousal visas, immigrant relative visas in our tier 2. So they are focused, and depending on the post, the backlogs of these cases may be longer in some places than others, but fiancé visas are definitely a priority.
Great. And you mentioned for fiancé visas specifically, the geographic proclamations no longer are applicable to those visas?
Exactly. And that's worth reinforcing. Since just last month, early August 7th, neither fiancé visas nor immigrant visa relatives are subject. There's an exception, a blanket determination that the Secretary made saying these were a national interest exception. So consular sections are free to process when they can, depending on local circumstances.
That's great. Next question is, how long does it take to process currently a current EB I-485 application?
That's a great question, and I'm sure we might get the applicant that question for each and every visa category. And first of all, I'm not going to get into. I can't really get in each and every visa category because, I'm not the expert in terms of the figures to begin with. But there are just so many variables that will make it difficult to answer your question. So, most, as many of you know, most immigrant visa applications start with a petition being filed with the Department of Homeland Security Citizenship Immigration Service. And that's one part of the world that I don't have visibility into. So how long does it take to get filed there? USCIS, I'm sure, is facing their own resource constraints as well as pandemic constraints. How long it takes to get approved by USCIS and then get to, depending on the circumstance, I may have mentioned the National Visa Center when I talked about the backlog numbers. all most of our immigrant visa cases, family preferences, immigrant visas, immediate relatives, I'm sorry, get routed through the National Visa Center. The National Visa Center also has their own processing that takes time, and sometimes people submit, but the documentation is not complete, so it takes time to go back and get that documentation. So this is a public service announcement saying, make sure, please, that if you're submitting documentation for yourself or on someone's behalf, that you follow all the directions as clearly as possible and prevent delays in that respect. But then at the end, if you have cases sitting in the National Visa Center that are scheduled for, that we're able to schedule, it really does come down to a particular post. What is that? So like, really not able to answer that question directly because, what post is that person applying to? Just as on the positive side, again, we don't have the proclamation preventing us from processing, and many of our posts have started resuming services. But in the survey we did a week or two ago, there are, I think, a dozen posts that were not doing immigrant visas for one reason or other. Some of them are COVID related, again, referring to the spike in South Asia, for example. Some of them were not COVID related. Burma and Russia come to mind. You guys probably know about the political situations in those places. So, again, sorry for my long-winded answers, but in the words of a great diplomat, the answer really is, it depends.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great point for everyone to remember, is that there are other circumstances besides COVID that might come into play when talking about IV processing times. Next question is from Emanuela. Hello, thank you for your time. Do you know about the status of the KCC backlog processing DV documents? It's been months since her documents have been there. So if we could talk about just KCC specifically, and how long it might take for those documents to be processed.
Yeah, the KCC, I talked with my colleagues there recently, and my advice again is just to be patient. They are processing as much as they can in the order the cases are received and that they're qualified. For those of you that are waiting for scheduling, wait please until you get contacted by the particular embassy or consulate that you've asked to be scheduled at. I also I've seen other questions that have come up over the last couple of weeks about KCC, and their leadership has reminded me too. So some of you may have asked these questions directly of KCC. If you're used to calling KCC, again, the Kentucky Consular Center, for those of you that aren't familiar, they basically had to, send all staff home due to the pandemic spike there last September, I believe, last fall. So they used to take phone calls. They don't anymore. Their messaging machines basically points people to emails. As you email them, be very patient, because not only is there a backlog of immigrant visas, there's a backlog of emails for KCC. They will get to them. I'd encourage you not to send a second or third or fourth follow-up just because it, adds to the queue. I understand, personally, I understand the urge to send follow-ups because it does get frustrating if we don't answer emails instantaneously. They are doing their best, and I that's all I can say on behalf of the colleagues there. They're doing their best. We're trying to get as many DVs scheduled as we can, and we'll continue to work to do so.
Great. Next question is from Depeche. Why are there 0 interviews scheduled except a few expedite cases on the F2A category, the spouse of a permanent resident?
Again, that's, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if I can get into each specific category just because there's so many factors. But certain posts are able to schedule family preferences, family preference cases. I understand you had on my colleague Charlie Oppenheim the other day, who talked about and can provide a lot more detail in terms of when cases are qualified, documentary qualified, and ready for scheduling, and when their numbers are what we call current. So I'm not going to go there, but if your case is ready to be scheduled in a particular case, It really just comes down to then the particular circumstances in that country. And again, back to the tiers, family preference immigrant visas are in the third tier of priority. So our post will try to do some, but for posts that have backlogs, their emphasis will be on processing through the fiancés and the immediate relatives in those cases. So as with many of these questions, I just have to advise patience.
Right, based on our prioritization guidance. Right.
Yep.
Next question is from Musawer Nouri. For the tier 1 category of visa prioritization, do applicants receive their interview letter without waiting?
Not sure if I'm following that question, but it's let me try to answer that.
All right, let me elaborate one more. Without waiting for the 1st and 15th of the given month, or will the 2NL, will it be sent with no wait time?
Gotcha. Well, that's okay. And this goes back to where we have a multi-step process again to talk about. So again, what the National Visa Center does is one thing. When the case might be ready to process, typically immediate relatives and spouses cases in the past have been ready to be processed pretty quickly. But a certain consular section, an embassy or consulate, just may not have the space to accept those cases. So going back to the example of the post I talked to last week, where I mentioned they had several local staff die and they had the pandemic spike in that particular country. When I talked to them, they talked about how they currently, at least for the next several months, they weren't accepting new cases from the National Visa Center. That's not because they don't want to, but it's because as they redo and reopen for services, they are processing many number of cases that were actually already at post. So when the section shut down last year, this particular section still had a number of cases that were post that they just had to stop processing on. As they've stopped and started over the last year, they've started to go through those, but there's still a number at post. And so they will work through those and other high priority cases before accepting newly scheduled appointments from NVC. And NVC and our post work closely together, but the National Visa Center will ask, post X, how many cases can you take this month? And they won't send the case until post X says they can take them.
Gotcha. Next question is from Maman Thomas. If I have an I-485 AOS done in October 2020 for an EB3, can we submit our medicals now before a request is made by USCIS?
I would, unfortunately, I would just follow the directions as they're given by NVC and USCIS. And without knowing exactly what directions you were given, I think the answer to that is probably going to be a no. The medicals usually come later in the process, but wait until you're given clear instructions on from the particular case, or in this USCIS, or from the post. And it goes back to some of the, you can tell through this conversation, a lot of my discussion is going to be general. I'm not able to really talk about each individual case. I used one post as an example because I talked to them last week, but I'm not able to go into each and every detail about a particular case or about a post. So apologize, but I hope that answers part of that question at least.
Definitely. We're going to take 4 more questions, and then that will be the last one for this session. But again, we will be going back to answer questions in the comments. So if your question wasn't answered, please be patient. I think that's the theme of this session, right? Be patient.
That's a great feeling, yeah.
And we will get to it. All right, from James Mensah, do you have any plans of increasing your staff?
That's a great question as well. I'm not the resources guy, so I'm not, just to lay that out front. So, I'll defer to those places. But I do want to reiterate some of the points I made earlier, which is, personally, it'd be great. It'd be great to have more staff. It'd be, if I ran the world, sure. But this is not purely a staffing issue. First of all, if the world was perfect and the powers that be in Congress and elsewhere gave us resources, gave us more staffing, first of all, on the staffing front, it takes a significant long amount of time to train, to get people ready to go out into the field and language training in order to adjudicate these cases. But more importantly and more critically, and to the point, in many of these cases, the backlog has arrived for, it's like a perfect storm. All these factors I talked about, the presidential proclamations, the fact that we had to shut down, and the current circumstances that posts face. So given that perfect storm, it will take us, again, back to the patience theme, it will take us time to work through this. We are working and doing our best, is exemplified though by those posts I talked about that are not processing any visas right now. It's going to be a nonlinear process. It will go in fits and starts, but we will get there. We'll get there as fastly and quickly and safely as we can. So yeah, if anyone has any connection to anyone that can give us more resources, I'd appreciate it. But honestly, it is not purely a human resource issue at all.
Great. Next question is from Arman. Do embassies prioritize medical professionals such as nurses under the EB3 category?
It's a great question. The EB3 is one of those categories that is a family preference category. Sorry, it's an employment preference category, if you will. So I mentioned earlier that both family preference and employment preference, as well as diversity visas, are in two of the tiers 3 and 4 out of our 4-tier prioritization. So we recognize the importance of medical professionals. Our posts are doing the best to process them and as many as they can, but it's a balancing game. There are certain exceptions if a professional is coming to help with the fight against COVID specifically, and has specific skills and emphasis in that area. That may be a different question, but all employment-based preference cases are in the lower tier priority. But again, we're not saying we're not processing them at all. We are doing some where we can. And as posts, I should also say, we have this prioritization schedule, but at some point, and there are posts like this already. There are posts that are, basically through their particular backlog. They're done. There's no fiance visas. There's no immediate relative visas. They have no cases that are normally thought of as tier 1 or tier 2. So they're back to routine services. And so they are fully able to process not only the employment-based medical ones, but the professionals, but the employment-based, you name it, as fully as they used to. So again, just it really depends on each particular counselor section.
Yep. All right. The next question is from Sylvie. Is it possible to maintain or go back to the regular capacity of interview processing by providing a COVID test, a negative COVID test report within 72 hours, similar to how for every person must provide that negative test when they travel on a US bound flight?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I actually applaud the creative thinking. That's an interesting question. Unfortunately, our counselor sections are, we're following CDC guidelines for social distancing and all of that internally as we snake people through our waiting rooms and determine how to schedule. But again, going back to what I said, each counselor section is operating in a unique environment in a specific locale. And each of these locales have their own rules, their own regulations on what they can do and what they can process. And not only what we can do in terms of how many people we can have in a building, but on, whether businesses are even open and so forth. So we need to follow, being a good diplomatic mission, our diplomatic missions have to follow local guidelines, local rules, local policies as well. So while we can make rules about incoming flights to our country, we're still subject to the rules and regulations and restrictions of the countries that we operate in.
Right, definitely. All right, from Charlotte. Why would consulates not book IR1 and CR1 interviews? It seems like that in May 2021 had quite a few consulates and embassies around the world where this priority category was not addressed.
Again, IR1s are immediate relatives. So, without knowing the specific circumstances or posts you're talking about, I can say that, they are in one of the top two tiers of immigrant visa priorities, immediate relatives, the spouse of a U.S. citizen. So our post, when they can, will prioritize them. But again, going back to the theme of patience, 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 and the theme of it depends. Every single circumstance is different depending on which country, which city our consular section relies on or resides in. And I can say that this guidance that we've talked about, we've reiterated this to the field in multiple messages, multiple calls. They know it, they're following it. If you see that immediately, you think you're a spouse and you're not getting recognized for some reason, rest assured, they have you on the list. They're doing as much as they can in that particular locale. The list is probably long and the circumstances may prevent full processing of immediate relatives, but they will work through the list in the order they have them, and do the best to as quickly and efficiently, as safely as processes as they can.
Thanks, Neal. I know these are tough questions. We're going to go to our last question for the session from Isabella. Have you actually ordered all embassies to resume IV processing? And what are you doing to ensure that the posts are following orders?
That's a good question. No, actually, in terms of ordering, what we've done is, let me reiterate the guidance that I've been talking about, is and really state clearly health and safety first. The priority is the health and safety of our applicants. It's the health and safety of our staff. It's the health and safety of everyone that comes into contact at the embassy. And it's also, as we said, following local rules and regulations and restrictions that might be in place. So we cannot order a consular section overseas to proceed if it's unsafe, if the pandemic is still widespread, if there's local regulations, local restrictions, local quarantine programs in effect. What I can say, though, that is we've been very, very clear about telling people and telling embassies and consulates that as they are safe to reopen, they must follow the prioritization guidance that we've laid out here in this call, that we've laid out publicly on our website. And so we talked, as I mentioned, I talked to a post on Thursday or Friday. We talked to posts, my team and the other teams that are in our office, in the field operations office, check in with our consular sections regularly, to help answer questions, provide guidance, but also, frankly, to make sure that they're following the prioritization schedule that we've laid out. I can assure you in our discussions that they understand the prioritization schedule, they're following that. And if they're capable, they're participating in our efforts to get this backlog reduced as quickly and as safely as possible. And again, please, please, please be patient. We understand the frustration. It's not an easy situation for any of us, let alone the petitioners and the beneficiaries of these applications. But we value all these applications, and we are doing our best to get through them.
Thanks, Neal, and thanks for all of the information that you've provided today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this chat today. Reminder that you can find a lot of the information about IV processing and IV prioritization and the numbers that Neal was mentioning earlier with regards to how many IV cases are qualified for the interview, but just waiting an interview. We update those numbers every month on our website, travel.state.gov. All right, Neal, great job today. And thank you for everything.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thanks to all those that are listening. It's been a pleasure.